The road to this year's midterm election officially kicks off this Tuesday in the New Jersey primary. Voters will decide who will win their party's nomination for the right to win it all this November. But with several incumbents losing the nod mainly over voter dissatisfaction, could many of the incumbents here in the Garden State suffer the same fate? Joining me now for more, Pat Politano, who is president of Strategic Message Management, and Republican blogger and strategist George Ajjan, founder of Ajjan Associates. We've seen these incumbents really face some severe challenges, the most recent and closest to New Jersey being Arlen Specter, really, who lost the Democratic nomination. Could this year be bad for any incumbent, regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat?
Not in this primary, Brenda. You're going to find that the New Jersey voters don't like tea. This isn't Kentucky. It's not Florida. This is an organizational state, and while most of these primaries are on the Republican side, which is always very difficult to predict in their primaries, overcoming the organization in these for these candidates is going to be nearly impossible. You're going to see the same lineups, I think, come November that we're accustomed to seeing.
To a great extent, I agree.
I can't believe it.
No. Well, look, it's the organizational structures are very strong. There's no doubt about that. And the only way you're going to beat them is if you've got money. And the Tea Party candidates that were successful, Rand Paul, notably in Kentucky, was very, very well funded and had an operation and money to fund the operation. Just going out there and having a website and saying I'm affiliated with the Tea Party and I've got some activists that are, mad as hell and not going to take it anymore is not enough to defeat a machine, particularly up against an incumbent.
And on the Republican side, which I'm happy to say we're one great big happy family as Democrats this time, that the Tea Party seems to be nothing more than a mask of the more right-wing Republicans who are just trying to pick up some of that cachet to what degree it has, but it's going to be very unsuccessful, I think, for those
But aren't there
folks.
so many kinds of Tea Parties? Are they all Republican?
They would say that they're not, but again, you're only seeing primaries on the Republican side. And as George pointed out, putting that little label after your name if nobody knows who you are doesn't do much good. And this is, besides the organization, a very difficult media dynamic in which for candidates to get known, very expensive. And it doesn't seem as if many of these challengers have the resources to compete.
Okay, we've seen Republican Governor Chris Christie beat incumbent Jon Corzine last year, of course, in the governor's race. Mm-hmm. But could Republicans in federal and county elections ride his win this term?
It's a completely different dynamic because you're talking about a primary versus a general election with a heavily unpopular incumbent, which was Jon Corzine. And that was a statewide race with tens of millions of dollars at stake. In these cases, you have primary elections with tens of thousands of dollars. In some cases, if the candidate is lucky as a challenger, he or she has raised $10,000.
But the governor's numbers have really been slipping.
But it's I would say two completely unrelated things. The governor ran against Corzine. He had a primary of his own, but he had the establishment backing, which, as Pat mentioned, is critically important. He was able to win, and he was able to win, convincingly in the general election. What these challengers that are affiliated with the Tea Party mostly are facing in the Republican primaries against establishment picks is a completely different situation, and it's going to be hard to imagine where they'd have enough funding and organization to unseat a machine-backed candidate.
But are we going to see a change?
You can see in November where being an incumbent could be a liability. It's a long way to November, and we'll find out. But the one thing that has been proven with the governor's race last year, these primaries around the state, is that nothing is for certain for these incumbents. It's very unpredictable. The electorate is still very agitated and upset with government, in many cases rightly so. So it'll reformulate, and we'll look at it again in November.
And is the anger becoming even more so, especially with all the budget cuts and that sort of thing?
I think there's a lot of anger altogether at the federal level, at the state level, at local level. The more there's this, as you mentioned about the Tea Party, it's maybe trying to be co-opted by a certain segment of the Republican Party, which is quite wise on their part. But it's people that heretofore had not necessarily been terribly involved in politics or taken much interest, but they feel a certain sense of anger and frustration with what's happening and suddenly want to get involved. I mean, I'm sure you'd agree what's absolutely shocking is this year, for the first time in many, many, many years, people lining up and having competitive primaries in districts which are considered very, very, very long shot wins in the fall. For example, the 9th District. We have 3 Republicans slugging it out to take on Steve Rothman, who's got well over $1 million in the bank and has comfortably won all of his races as an incumbent.
And I think some of this is the Tea Party folks are sort of reality challenged as well. These are not going to be competitive elections, some of those in November.
And
people are
before we
upset
get to
and angry.
specific legislative districts, I mean, when we talk about issues like what's going on in the Gulf oil crisis, people are very angry about that. Are we going to see that being reflected in the election?
I think you see this in November in particular. I don't think you'll see it in next week. But in November, there's a whole bunch of factors that still have people upset. Difficult jobs, difficult tax situation, as you mentioned, the budget cuts, news that is unsettling to look at the environmental circumstances and just wholly unusual. And how that mixes in that pot is what could cause incumbents to be nervous, and they are all nervous.
Do you think people at one time might have taken it out in terms of not giving to a candidate, but now maybe they don't have the money, so therefore they take it out by going to vote against or for someone?
Well, the point of being an activist and being a volunteer, as a candidate, you would often say, I would much rather have somebody who's going to give me 20 hours a week making phone calls and knocking on doors than to give me $100, for example. There's some certain value in having activists, but you cannot win a congressional election that covers, several counties and tens and thousands of people that you need to reach just based on activists. You need to have money that funds your signs, that funds your mailers, that potentially radio and even TV ads. That stuff costs money, and your activists can't do that for you.
I think what George is saying is it has to be directed. And I think one of the things that's sort of interesting, but ultimately of little use on the part of the Tea Party is what I've been calling is sort of a kick the dog mentality. The people were angry and they're upset and they kicked the dog. Now the dog didn't have anything to do with it, but the same kind of anger is being vented in any number of ways, which again makes it unpredictable as to what will occur.
Right.
Okay, back to the legislative districts right now. Which do you think is going to be the most competitive in terms of votes?
The most competitive of the primaries we have this time around. Well, the 9th district is a three-way race. So whenever you have a three-way race, it can be much more of an interesting dynamic than a simple two-way race. So in that district, you've got a machine-backed candidate who's got a very interesting profile, Michael Augusta, who's I think a former military man and I think perhaps a federal marshal. Then you've got running outside the organization a businessman, small business owner, and runs a family business by the name of Michael Aslanian. And then you have a Ukrainian immigrant running as well. So it's a sort of a shame because each of those profiles in and of themselves would make an interesting contrast to Steve Rothman, but they're all slugging it out against one another.
What do you think?
I like, I've been looking at the Republican side in the Palone district where Diane Gooch, who has enormous personal wealth and put up a very interesting, well-crafted, unusually well-crafted commercial that she's probably the only candidate I've seen in 20 years.
Yeah, she's got 2 commercials running already.
And a very conservative, anti-choice, anti-immigration candidate who's a local elected official and former freeholder and has a substantial portion of that extreme right wing of the Republican Party. That one, to me, is interesting to see how that plays out.
Will you stay here for a moment? We're going to continue talking, okay?
Sure.